находится в ужасном положении.
To make movies, you need
То
money.
есть, для того, чтобы сделать фильм, нужны деньги. Для того, чтобы написать
To write
стихотворение,
poetry,
нужна
all you need are
музыка,
some paper and
лист
pencils.
бумаги и карандаш. Я
I bow to those
преклоняюсь
directors
перед режиссерами,
that keep
которые
trying with
стараются
what they have
делать свои фильмы, собственно.
to make their own movies. Hello and welcome to Cursed Productions, the podcast where we talk about movies, TV shows, and plays that had disastrous productions. I'm your host, Jacob Kosachowski. Today we'll be discussing the 1978 Soviet-era film Stalker, directed by Andrei Tarkovsky. Now, this is easily one of my favorite films of all time, which makes all that happened behind the scenes a bit more tragic for me. Before we get into the real meat and potatoes of what happened in this production, I think you guys should get to know a little bit of the plot of the film as well. For those who are unfamiliar, I'll give a brief summary. We begin in a distant future, seeing one of our protagonists who is unnamed, only going by the title Stalker. A stalker is an illegal position whereas you bring other people out to what is called the zone. We as an audience, and even the people within the film, do not understand why the zone is sectioned off, but they know that traversing through it is a dangerous task. People want to make this journey through the zone, though, because they wish to enter the room. In the center of the zone is the legendary room, which is rumored to grant the innermost desires of anyone who enters. The stalker is tasked to bring two men to the zone, the two only being named as the writer and the professor, both having their own reasons for needing this journey. The rest of the film details the hypnotic venture these men go through to get to the room. Now, I won't say too much more about the plot because I sincerely believe that you guys should all go out and watch this film. The way that it marries faith and existing in the Soviet Union is incredibly unique, and it feels just very personal to Tarkovsky.
Зона — это очень сложная система ловушек, что ли. Но стоит тут появиться людям, как все здесь приходит в движение.
Even before this film, Tarkovsky was having a rough spat with a couple of his other projects. His autobiographical film, The Mirror, was only allowed to be released domestically in 1975, being barred from any showings abroad. In this period, he also attempted a couple other screen projects, one being an adaptation of Dostoevsky's The Idiot, and a script based on the life of German romantic poet E.T.A. Hoffmann. Both of these projects were met with hostility by the folks in charge of the Soviet film policy. This really discouraged Tarkovsky so much so that he was going to give up on cinema. Throughout all this, though, Tarkovsky was able to produce Stalker, but not without its own issues. One of the first issues that came up during the production of the film was the casting of the Stalker's wife. Tarkovsky's own wife demanded that she played the role. Supposedly, she was extremely difficult to work with, and there were even reports of her getting nicknamed as the Empress. The film's director of photography, Georgy Rurberg, convinced Tarkovsky to have a real actress to play the role, which caused a great bit of tension with his wife. With this, you might think that Rurberg and Tarkovsky got along well on set, but that could not be any further from the truth. Tarkovsky brought Rurberg on from working on his previous film, The Mirror, because they really wanted to capture the texture of the abandoned factories that they were shooting in Tallinn, Estonia, which will be an issue later, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Tarkovsky found himself taking control of the camera a lot during production, leaving Rurberg with little to nothing to do, so he drank. In a documentary about the film, author Sean Martin spoke a bit about what working with Tarkovsky might have been like.
Tarkovsky is, if you like, the quintessential auteur. He liked to quote Tolstoy, "Never trouble others with what you can do yourself." The problem with that was it made Tarkovsky look a bit like an egomaniac.
The rest of the film shot smooth enough, and they took the film back to Moscow to develop it. But for some reason, the footage had this harsh green tint to it. There are two reasons for this setback: errors in development and a faulty batch of film. They shot on Kodak 5247 stock, which at the time was experimental. This stock actually became industry standard later on, but that's besides the point. nobody knew how to properly use this film, and more or less they lost the entire film, leading them to have to reshoot. Because of all this, they fired several people on the production line, one of which being Rurberg. In Tarkovsky's published diary, it was written that he believed Rurberg was not only a terrible cinematographer, but also a terrible person, which would lead people to think that things were extremely tense between the two, but that might have actually been a bit exaggerated. Tarkovsky would actually dictate his diary and have several other people write it, one of which being his wife, who absolutely hated Rurberg for getting her fired from the role. So the story of their hatred might not have as many teeth to it as it might have seemed. The studio was almost ready to pull the plug on the film, but decided to give Tarkovsky a second chance. Given no extra money from the studio, Tarkovsky had to use the money left from the first shoot to fund the next one. He hired Leonid Kalashnikov as the new DP, and because the original location they wanted to shoot in was destroyed in an earthquake, they shot in an abandoned hydroelectric plant in Estonia. But after looking through the footage of this shoot, Tarkovsky hated the film, said that there was no magic in it, and just like that, Leonid was gone as well. For the third shoot, Tarkovsky brought in DP Alexander Knyazhinsky, and the film this go-around was vastly different from what they shot previously, and this version is what we all eventually got to see. There are only 2 shots from the original shoot that made it to the full film. One of these 2 shots was of a river that was covered in a reddish foam. Now this came from paper pulp that was dumped into the river by an industrial complex. Other shots in this film were near hydropower plants and an old fluorochemical factory in the center of Tallinn. Fortunately, it's not hard to see what could have happened next. Many people in the crew would pass away from illnesses that could likely be traced back from the filming of this movie. Vladimir Sharam, who was the sound recordist for the film, has said, quote, "Up the river was a chemical plant, and it poured out poisonous liquids downstream. There is even this shot in Stalker, snow falling in the summer and white foam floating down the river. It was in fact some horrible poison." End quote. Ultimately, several members of the crew died from lung cancer, 3 of which being Anatoly Solonitsyn, who masterfully played the writer in the film, Tarkovsky's wife, and Tarkovsky himself. Because all of this, people have almost viewed the film as an extension of the zone itself. The eerie and unnatural conditions certainly lend to that idea, even having moments in the film that almost feel prophetic.
Another one of the strange prophetic aspects of Stalker is that during the dream sequence, when the Stalker's wife is reciting from the Book of Revelation, you're going over a gun and some medical equipment and the Van Eyck Ghent altarpiece. You also see a calendar, a page torn off from a calendar, and it says December the 28th, and it's under the water floating like a leaf. December the 28th, 1986, was Tarkovsky's last day alive.
Hearing about all of this tragedy makes the consumption of this piece of art even more important to me. It's important to not let the efforts of those who have passed go to waste. The film, in my opinion, is an art house masterpiece, and like I said earlier, I would extremely recommend you to watch this film. Now, we are nearing the end of this podcast, and I want to thank you all for listening to today's episode. This has been Jacob from Curse Productions, and I'll leave you with a quote that really stands out to me from Andrei Tarkovsky.
And I'd like to tell directors, especially young ones, that they should be morally responsible for what they do while making their films. Do you understand? It's the most important of all. Secondly, they should be prepared for the thought that cinema is a very difficult and serious art. It requires sacrificing of yourself. You should belong to it. It shouldn't belong to you. Cinema uses your life, not vice versa. Therefore, I think that this is the most important. You should sacrifice yourself to the art. This is what I've been thinking lately about my profession.